Welcome, everyone. I am Stephanie Balkin. I'm the Director of Arts and Talks and Adult Programs at the JCC of Mid-Westchester. We're so excited for you to join us. This program is a collaboration between Arts and Talks, which is bringing world-class arts and culture to Westchester, and our Senior Connections program at JCCMW. I'd also like to thank our partners in this, our Westchester Hadassah Group and Pam Hoffman specifically, as well as the Jewish Book Council, which was instrumental in helping us bring Julie Orringer here today. This is a series of virtual book talks that we've been doing since we're not able to be together as a community, but we're still trying to engage everyone and still give a sense of the Westchester community, that we have resilience, especially in today's climate and what's happening to everybody. We wish everyone good health, safety, happiness, and especially on this Yom HaShoah day, it's a good time to think about all we have and to be thankful and to remember those lives that were lost. So we are moving on to the virtual book talk portion of the morning. We are delighted to have with us Julie Orringer. She's the author of 3 award-winning books, The Flight Portfolio, The Invisible Bridge, and How to Breathe Underwater. Julie is the winner of Paris Review's Plimpton Prize and has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Cullman Center at the New York Public Library, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard, the MacDowell Colony, and Yaddo. She lives in Brooklyn with her husband and children. Without further ado, please help me welcome Julie Orringer. And I would like to also just mention, Julie will be giving a presentation about her book, The Flight Portfolio. And if you have questions for the author, please chat them to me. And that way, you guys are all muted. Please chat them to me at the bottom of the screen. There is a little chat button, and feel free to ask any questions, and I will pass them along to Julie. So without further ado, please help me welcome Julie Orringer. I'm sure there's a lot of clapping happening.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for having me. Thanks to the Arts and Talks series and to the JCC of Mid-Westchester. It's especially significant to be with you on Yom HaShoah because the life of the person who we're talking about today is one that has to be included in our collective memories of the Shoah. So I'm really happy that, that this timing worked out the way it did. I just want to be sure, can everybody hear me okay?
Thumbs up if you can hear. Yep, good.
Okay, great. Yeah, so thank you, Stephanie, for that introduction and for helping to set this all up. It's really a pleasure to be with you, and it's really heartening to see your faces. It's, you know, we've all been in our small and circumscribed worlds, and it's really great to be reminded that there's a community out there of readers and thinkers and members of our larger collective family who are willing to come together at a moment like this. So thank you so much for being here. I want to begin by reading to you a little bit from this novel, The Flight Portfolio. This is the novel that I wrote about Varian Fry, about his experiences in 1940 and 41 in Marseille. I'm just going to read to you without too much preamble, and then we're going to talk a little bit about who Varian was and how this book came into being, and what it means to write a book about a real person, a fictional book about a real person. So I'm just going to start at the beginning. If you happen to have the book with you, I'm going to ask of you what I ask of my graduate students, which is that you not follow along while I'm reading. I always like to have my grad students read to one another, but I think because so many of us are unaccustomed as adults to the experience of simply being read to, we have to be reminded sometimes to put the text aside and just to listen. So that's what I'm going to be asking of you this morning. So I'm going to start at the beginning The first section of the book is called Despise What Is Not Courage, which is a line that's drawn from an E. E. Cummings poem. And this first chapter is called Gordes. It's spelled Gordes. It's a place name in southern France. There was, as it turned out, no train to the village where the Chagalls lived, one of many complications he'd failed to anticipate. He had to pay a boy with a motorbike to run him up from the station at Cavaillon, 10 miles at a brain-shaking pace along the narrow, rutted road. On either side rose ochre hills, striated with grapevines and lavender and olive trees. Overhead, the blinding white-veined sky. The smell was of the boy's leather jacket and of charred potatoes, exhalate of his clever homemade fuel. At the foot of the village, the boy parked in the shadow, accepted Varian's francs, and tore off into the distance before Varian could arrange a ride back. The streets of Gordes, carved into a sun-struck limestone hill above the Luberon Valley, offered little in the way of shade. He would have given anything to be back in Marseille with a glass of Éperol before him, watching sailors and girls, gangsters and spice vendors parading the Canebière. The Chagalls had only agreed to see him on the basis that he not bring up the prospect of their emigration. But what other subject was there? The Nazis had taken Paris months ago. They were burning books in the streets of Alsace. They could send any refugee over the border at will. At least the Chagalls had agreed that was something. But as he reached the house, an ancient Catholic girls' school on the Rue de la Fontaine-Basse, he found himself fighting the urge to flee. His credentials, if anyone examined them, amounted to a fanatic's knowledge of European history, a desire to get out from behind his desk in New York, and a deep frustration with his isolationist nation. And yet, this was his job. He'd volunteered for it. What was more, he believed he could do it. He raised his hand and knocked. An eye appeared in the brass circlet of the peephole, and a girl in a striped apron opened the door. She listened, strangling her index finger with one dark curl as he stated his name and mission. Then she ushered him down a corridor and out into a courtyard where a stone path led to a triangle of shade. There, at a bare wooden table, Chagall and his wife sat at lunch, the painter in his smock, his hair swept back from his forehead in silver waves, Bella in a close-fitting black dress, too hot for the day. "Ah, Monsieur Fry," Chagall said, rising to meet him. The painter's eyes were large and uncommonly sharp, his expression one of bemusement. "You've come after all. I thought you might. You won't forget our agreement, will you?" "All I want is your company for an hour." "Ah, you're lying, of course, but you lied charmingly." They sat together at the table, Bella on Varian's left, the painter to his right. He, Varian Fry, sitting down with the Chagalls. With Chagall, author of those color-saturated visions, those buoyant bridal couples and intelligent-eyed goats he'd seen in hushed rooms at the Museum of Modern Art. Bella filled a plate with brown, hard-crusted meat, soft cheese, sardines crackling with salt. She handed it across the table, assessing Varian in silence. "Had you been here a few days ago, we would have had tomatoes," Chagall said. "A farmer brings them up to the market on Thursdays. I'm sorry we don't have more to offer. The bread's a little hard on the tooth, I'm afraid, but c'est la guerre." "This is lavish," Varian said. "You're too kind." "Not at all. We'd like to share what we have." He gestured around him at the bare yellow stones, the rough benches, the shock of gold-green hillside visible through an archway in the wall. "As you see, we're living a quiet and retired life in our little dacha. No one will bother us here at Gordes." "You have a studio," Varian said. "You're still making work. That's what makes you dangerous." "Our daughter says the same," Bella said. "She's been saying it for months." "But you understand, Monsieur Fry, my husband's reputation will protect him. Vichy wouldn't dare touch us." "With respect, Madame Chagall, I don't believe that for a moment. Vichy is subject to the Nazis' whims, and we all know what they're capable of. I've seen it myself. I was in Berlin in '35, sent by the magazine I worked for. My last night in town, there was a riot on the Kurfürstendamm. The things I saw: men pulled from their shops and beaten in the streets, an old man stabbed through the hand at a cafe table, boys dragging a woman by her hair. These things happened in Germany, Chagall said, his tone harder now. They won't happen here, not to us. Let me speak to my friend at the consulate, Varian said. Ask him to start a file for you at least. If you do decide to leave, it might take months. Chagall shook his head. My apologies, Monsieur Fry. I'm sorry you had to come all this way in vain. But perhaps you'd like to have a look at the studio before you go. If you've finished, that is. Varian couldn't speak. He could scarcely believe that a person of Chagall's intelligence, a person of his experience, could fail to see what he himself saw clearly. Chagall rose and crossed the courtyard to a set of 10-foot-high blue doors, and Varian got to his feet. He nodded his thanks to Bella, then followed Chagall across the broken paving stones. Beyond the blue doors was a long, high-ceilinged room with a wall of windows, the former refectory of the girls' school. Canvases lay about everywhere, and for long minutes, Varian walked among them in silence. As well as he knew the painter's work, he had never seen it like this, in its pupil state, damp and mutable, smelling of turpentine, raw wood, wet clay. From the canvases rose ghost-like images, a grave-eyed Madonna hovering above a shadowed town, serenaded by cows and angels, crucified Christ wrapped in a prayer shawl, his head encircled by grieving sages, a woman kneeling beside a river, pressing a baby to her chest, clusters of red and white flowers rising like flames. It's no small matter to cross an ocean, Chagall said. More can be lost than canvas and paint. An artist must bear witness, Monsieur Fry. He cannot turn away, even if he wishes to. Don't stop there, you know.
Can I just mention something? I have muted everybody, but there's still noise. So I'm wondering what's going on. Julie, can you hear that while you're speaking? I just want to make sure that everyone can hear properly.
You know, I think it must be the fan of my computer spinning.
Okay. Can we maybe?
And I'm not sure that there's anything I can do about that actually, because
no problem. Okay, let's just keep going then. Thanks.
So I'll just can you hear me over it? Is it very loud for you?
Not that loud. No, it can be louder.
Okay. No, what I think I'll do is I'm just going to quit a couple of other things to see if I can get my computer's processor to cool a bit so it won't spin.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for bearing with us, you know, technology. Hear it.
Okay. I think my computer should spin down.
Okay, great. We'll just keep going then. Thank you.
Okay. Actually, you know what I'll do is I'm going to use my headset. There.
Okay.
Are you still getting that noise, or is that better?
That's better.
Okay, super.
Thank you.
Super. Okay, so the Flight Portfolio, this novel that I just read you the first couple pages of, tells the story of Varian Fry, a New York journalist who had really very little experience with immigration issues, although he was quite knowledgeable about the situation in Europe. The novel narrates how he located the artists who were on a special list that his organization drew up of people who were particularly endangered in France at that time, how he managed to find these people and then shepherd them through the Byzantine process of acquiring papers and tickets so that they could get out of France. The novel talks about how he had to resist forces both within the French government and our own State Department to get his clients the visas they needed, etc. But it's not just that, it's also the story of his personal journey, the process of the unmaking and remaking of his life. But let's talk a little bit about how a person gets there. How does a writer move from hearing about a real person's experiences, hearing about a little bit of a life, and thinking about how that life might become a novel, and then how is a novel like this made? So that's the trajectory that I'm going to trace for you, or try to in this talk today. The journey to this book, The Flight Portfolio, actually began in my previous novel, The Invisible Bridge. That book also takes place during World War II, before and during World War II, and about half of it takes place in France. So in the course of my research for that book, I was studying what happened when the Germans came in, and how they occupied France, and what the terms of their occupation were. And so I studied the Franco-German armistice, the most famous clause of which is Article 19. It's known as the Surrender on Demand Clause. And it stipulates that the French state had to turn over to German authorities any German national on French territory who would then frequently face deportation to a concentration camp. So when I Googled that phrase, surrender on demand, in order to learn more about that, those stipulations, what came up was this book, Surrender on Demand. This is Varian Fry's memoir. And he wrote this book shortly after his return from France in 1941. It was published in 1945. I had never heard the guy's name before, but as soon as I started reading about what he had done, just Googling him and looking him up a little bit on Wikipedia, I thought, oh my God, I need to read this book. So what I learned was that Fry, who was born in 1907, went to Marseille in 1940 to try to save these artists and writers blacklisted by the Gestapo. He arrived in August of 1940 with a list of about 200 names, meticulously compiled by a group of like-minded Europeans and Americans who were back in New York. And he had $3,000 of clandestine money taped to his leg, because he wasn't supposed to bring American dollars into France in that amount at that time. He planned to stay for about a month. His original plan was to rent a bicycle and to cycle around the south of France, seeing if he could round up these people on his list and get them out of the country. He ended up staying for more than a year, and getting more than 2,000 clients out, both by legal and illegal means, and helping to arrange for them to have a means for setting up their lives in the States when they arrived. So among the writers and artists he saved were not only Marc Chagall and his wife, who you saw in that first chapter, but also people like André Breton, Jacqueline Lamba, Max Ernst, Jacques Lipschitz, and Hannah Arendt. So faced with this story, having read this book and thought, oh my God, this guy's story is incredible. How can it be that I made it all the way through my Jewish education without ever hearing about him? I found myself in a very tough spot. I hadn't even finished my first novel. I didn't really even know if I could write a first novel. I'd only written short stories before that. Yet, as I read Varian's memoir, I felt beyond a doubt that a novel had to be written about him. There was not one that existed. If you read his memoir, which you should, you'll see that the tone of the book is kind of spy novelesque. It's kind of noirish. It feels like the movies of that time. And I kept thinking about who the person was who was underneath that voice. You know, it felt almost like the eye of that book was wearing a costume, and I wanted to know who the costume wearer was. I wanted to know who he really was. I felt like he had more stories to tell than he had room or liberty to put on the page in his book, written in 1945, which was not only a time when the social mores were quite different from what they are now, but also it was a time when most Americans didn't want to really be thinking about the war any longer, especially if it meant acknowledging that the United States itself had not always acted perfectly. So needing a lot of time to research and to think about this story, and to finish the previous book, I applied for a fellowship at the New York Public Library's Cullman Center, where there was just an incredible trove of information about Varian Fry. I spent that fellowship time finishing the other book, but also allowing this new book to begin to take flight. So I just want to tell you a little bit about what I learned at the library and in the time that followed that. So Varian Fry, as I learned, was the son of a moderately successful stockbroker and a mother who likely suffered from bipolar disorder. He grew up in Ridgewood, New Jersey, where I gave a talk a few months ago, and it was just incredible to see how that community has embraced this this Holocaust hero. They have a street named after him, and at the library there's a beautiful memorial to him. He went to a series of schools, mostly boarding schools, dropped out of a number of them in protest against the hazing rituals that often went on there. He was later educated at Harvard in the late 20s, where he started an avant-garde literary magazine called The Hound and Horn, which I have the first copy of here. It's really cool. I found it on a Libris. I ordered it long ago. It's an artifact. I mean, this is the actual thing. He started it with Lincoln Kirstein, who, as you may know, later went on to become a ballet impresario here in New York, founded the New York City Ballet. And this magazine was marvelously successful for what it was at the time, but Varian's college career was not that successful by comparison. He had many academic and behavioral suspensions and was nearly expelled for planting a for sale sign on the dean's lawn and getting caught at it. But eventually he graduated, and he married an incredible woman named Eileen Avery Hughes. She was an editor at the Atlantic Monthly and the best friend of Lincoln Kirstein's sister. And they really had an unbelievable intellectual connection, and were both spouses and best friends, to be sure. And so a few years later, they moved to New York, and they started literary lives there. Varian went on to become the editor of The Living Age, the magazine that he references in that first chapter of the novel. And as I mentioned, they sent him to Europe at the time to learn more about the situation. The Living Age was basically a journal of foreign affairs. It was written for Americans about the political situation abroad. And the editorial board felt that without having spent some time in Germany, Varian couldn't really deeply understand what was going on there at the time. So he spent his months there traveling around the country, visiting cities and towns, learning how the Nazi Party recruited support and spread its beliefs. He attended Hitler Youth rallies. He talked to local and national leaders of the Nazi Party. And he wrote about what he witnessed. If you go to the New York Times, you can access on their website this incredible archive called Times Machine, where you can search all of the articles that were written between now and 1881. Okay, if you have not done this before, you absolutely must. This is an incredible thing to do during quarantine time. It is a searchable archive, and you can page through your results virtually online. You can see what Varian Fry was writing about the Nazis' plans for the Jews at that time, which were surprisingly explicit, considering the number of years that then passed between the planning and the implementation. So on his last night in Berlin, Varian witnessed an anti-Jewish riot on the Kurfürstendamm. He saw those flagrant and repeated acts of violence that he mentions in the chapter that I read to you, carried out against Berlin's Jewish citizens in plain sight and with the approval of the police. He wrote about that experience too for the New York Times, where it prefigured a lot of what was going to follow. So because he knew so much about what was happening in Europe, he was one of the first people in the United States to understand the peril that was facing German citizens, and in his particular specific interest, Jews and those whose artistic work had caused them to run afoul of the Nazi Party. So in the summer of 1940, he got together with a number of others here in New York to form this group called the Emergency Rescue Committee, whose mission you now know. He himself volunteered to do the work on the ground in France, though he really didn't have any experience doing anything like this. No experience securing visas for refugees, no experience providing relief work, which was going to be the kind of cover front for his organization. But he was the only member of the Emergency Rescue Committee who combined a knowledge of the political situation with the ability to travel safely, since he wasn't actually a refugee himself. So there's my neighbor's phone ringing. Hold on just a minute. Okay. So off he went. He took this plane called the Yankee Clipper to France. You can look in these amazing archives where you can actually find like the dinner menu from the plane, which he saved. You know, he has stationery from the plane. In those days, planes had their own stationery. It was considered so prestigious to ride the Yankee Clipper to France that, you know, that you wanted to write people letters from it. It took about 2 days to get there. And so he landed on the ground there in France with absolutely no idea of how to proceed, who to turn to for aid, or how to make sense of the Byzantine requirements for emigration. But luckily, he wasn't alone. There were a number of people who were helping him out there in Marseille. And I'm going to just switch to PowerPoint for a second so I can show you some of them. I have these cute sketches of them. I'm going to go over to PowerPoint just for a second here. Let's see. Can you see my screen?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So these are some sketches that were published in the original printing of Surrender on Demand. And this will be our guide to a couple of the people I'm going to tell you about. Can you see my cursor on the screen, my little arrow?
Yes, yes.
Awesome. So this gentleman here, who Varian calls Beamish, was the future world-renowned economist Albert Hirschman. He had fought on the side of the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War. He was multilingual. He was well-connected. He was unafraid to work the underground channels in Marseille, which were incredibly important. Marseille had a thriving black market at the time, and he figured out ways to use it to help his clients at the Emergency Rescue Committee get false papers and money and ways out of the country. Many people actually got out on clandestine black market boats. And he was the guy who was kind of the liaison to those black market channels. And then down here on my lower right, we have Miriam Davenport. She was a former Bostonian and an art historian who studied at the Sorbonne. She'd fled south from Paris at the start of the occupation with the satirical German author Walter Mehring, who we see just above her here after the country was occupied, along with some of their friends. So she had access to this vast network of refugees. She was incredibly important in helping Varian find the people he was looking for. And because of her background in art history, she also had this amazing aesthetic sense that helped her to make the decisions that sometimes determined whether the Emergency Rescue Committee would help Varian's potential clients or not. It was obviously an incredibly different moral position to be in, which we can talk about in a little bit. She brought her friends Danny and Theo Benedict with her. Danny here had worked in the visa office of the police prefecture in Paris, so he knew all the bureaucratic ins and outs and how to help the clients get visas and how to circumvent them. he was incredibly pivotal in getting these clients their exit visas in particular. And his wife, Theo, had an incredible mind for technology and for organization. And then, let's see, I want to just get out here for a second and show you somebody else. Hold on just a minute here. So here is somebody else who I wanted to show you. You may have heard her name before. Okay. So this is Mary Jane Gold. She was an American heiress who had gone to finishing school in Italy and spent the years immediately afterwards just tearing around Europe in her own plane, which she flew herself. She was a friend of Miriam Davenport's, and she became a major donor to the Emergency Rescue Committee. She also volunteered in the office herself. Let me get back to her there. Interviewing potential clients, talking to people about their needs and about their experiences. And she had this incredible idea, which was to rent a villa in the countryside where Varian and his colleagues and his most endangered surrealist clients could live. So in this house, which was about a half an hour outside of Marseille, about 6 or 7 of Varian's clients and staff members lived for a number of months, holding these incredible parties and art exhibitions and making up games and creating work. And so there was this very fertile artistic kind of colony, as it were, just outside of Marseille. It was just amazing to think about what was going on there in the midst of the war. And finally, there was this guy, Harry Bingham, so important. He was the vice consul at the US Visa Department of the American Consulate. Generally speaking, it's really important to understand that the American consulate was inimical to Varian's vision of getting people out of France. They didn't want their shores overrun by Jews and possible communists. They also felt that Varian's work might compromise the United States diplomatic mission to France. Among other things, they were worried about losing the French naval fleet to the Nazis. So going against the general orders of his department, which were not to grant visas to Jews or former anti-Nazis who might have communist sympathies, Harry Bingham made it possible for hundreds of Varian's refugees to gain entrance to the States. And he also used his own private villa as a hiding place for refugees. So that is just a little bit about how things worked there. All of these people were working together to get people like Werfel and Jacques Lipschitz and Heinrich Mann and Hannah Arendt and Max Ernst out of France. And so there was a marvelous image archive at the New York Public Library from which I checked out multiple examples of the pieces of art that had motivated Varian's work. And I read the works of the writers who he saved and did everything I could to learn about who they were. But there were all of these missing pieces. Essentially, what was difficult for me and what I realized that I had to do in order to actually begin to write this novel was to go to France myself. There's really no substitute for actually being there. So despite the fact that I was about 25 weeks pregnant at the time, I got on a plane and I went to Marseille. And I spent a few weeks there. I was living on the 5th floor of this walk-up building, like trudging up the stairs every day, like multiple times with my pregnant belly. Just walking around the town and looking at the buildings and looking at the quality of light and smelling the streets and listening to the languages that were spoken there. And going out to where the Villa Herbel had once stood, even though it had long ago been razed, and just trying to inhabit for a minute the life of somebody who arrived in this city with no experience doing what he was doing in the midst of a war, trying to navigate these official and unofficial channels to try to gain exit for his clients. And doing so always under the scrutiny of the French authorities who were constantly threatening to throw him out. So as I started thinking about how to write a novel about this guy's experience, one thing that kept coming back to my mind was the question of what kind of person undertakes a mission like the one Varian Fry took on. And those answers were not immediately clear to me, either from the memoir or from the research into the time he spent in Marseille. And so the place I went next was this place. I don't know if you guys can see, let's see well enough where this is. This is Harvard. I spent a year in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And one incredible thing that happened was that just before I got there, all of Varian's students' records were sealed. So all of his transcripts and the letters that his dad had written to the dean about his poor academic performance and vice versa, and records of every building he'd ever lived in, and all kinds of papers and documents had just been unsealed. And so I spent time just going through all this stuff, just trying to understand what his life was like at the time. And I remember standing in a room in that building that I just showed you, that residence hall called Winthrop House, which was known during Varian's time there as Gore Hall, and looking out of one of those windows onto the Charles River from Varian's familiar perspective. And that was when I understood that what really was going to drive this book was his inner struggle, and that the book had to illuminate not only the external political situation, but the internal contours, and that in order to do that, I was going to need to create characters who could have existed, who likely existed in other forms, but who hadn't necessarily inhabited Varian's real life. Characters whose stories might plausibly run alongside his own, but that would exist entirely within the realm of fiction. Human beings who, if they'd existed at the time, would not have been welcome to record their inner lives. Invented characters who might help us to understand who the real human being was and how he came to do the incredible things that he did. So I went home to New York. I immersed myself in Varian's archives at Columbia University, where I had access to the photos he'd taken, his cocktail napkin jottings, the letters that he'd written to his wife, his telegrams. I read letter after letter, wondering whether there would ever be an end to what I needed to learn. And by now I was like 8 years into my research, and I was like, okay, this is it. It's time to just start writing. So I holed up at the Brooklyn Writers Space, which is about 10 minutes down the road here from my house, and kind of left my papers at home and only brought along basically his memoir and a couple of other good biographies, and started writing in earnest. And what I discovered in the course of my writing was the character of Elliot Grant, a fictional friend of Varian's from Harvard, one who had once worked with Varian and Lincoln Kirstein on The Hound and Horn. So this friend shows up in Marseille with a specific mission, which is to help his own lover find and rescue his son. In the course of doing this, he recruits Varian to his mission, and the old bond between them reignites. And in that ignition, an element of this narrative lit up for me too, which was the question of how our own personal lives and biases can affect life or death decisions that we have to make. The question of what love is worth, and whether we can allow it to change our lives, even if it threatens to them. The question of what makes human life valuable, and the burning question of how we persist in what we believe, despite all the forces that may be arranged against us. So this draft expanded. I worked with my incredible editor, Jordan Pavlin at Knopf, who helped me understand what was really essential to the book. And eventually, about 11 years after I had first come across this book, I finally had a draft of of the book that I felt that I could share with other people. So what is it that takes you through 11 years of writing a book? For me, it was really just this one thing. I wanted everyone to know who Varian Fry was, how he managed to fly in the face of incredible odds to do what he felt he needed to do, how he managed to go against the forces of 3 governments who were all inimical to his mission, his own inexperience, his lack of funds, his lack of time, and an encroaching war to figure out how to get his clients to safety on our shores. And that is really the reason that this book exists today. He was one of the first Americans, in fact, he was the first American to be recognized by Yad Vashem as righteous among nations. And yet I had never heard his name. I wanted everybody to understand who he was. I wanted people to know his story and to think about what he had done. Despite the fact that he won the Croix de Chevalier of the Legion of Honor, he died basically unknown, and his work has been chronically under-recognized. So I really want this to change. I want everyone to know what this one uncommon American did in support of his beliefs, especially because now, as then, we all have a responsibility to stand up for what we believe. Refugees continue to be challenged and threatened throughout the world. I don't know if you heard yesterday that Trump is basically closing our borders to all immigration right now, using the coronavirus as an opportunity to advance a political agenda. And so for those of us who care about the fate of refugees, I want you to know about how this one person undertook this work and managed to carry on in the face of unbearable odds. Because his life reminds us of the power of the individual, even when there are incredible impediments. So really that's why I'm speaking to you today. And I'm happy to take any questions that you might have about any of this. I'd be thrilled to hear your thoughts.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Julie. That was amazing, really, to hear about Varian Fry and what he did and how you were able to tie the historical aspects and factual aspects together with fiction, that you created these 2 narratives together. I think many people would love to hear why you named the book The Flight Portfolio. Exactly what was the Flight Portfolio? Can you shed some light on that?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. Let's see here. Hold on just one sec. I'm going to share a little image with you as I answer that question. It's just too fun to be able to show you anything that's on my own computer. There's a manuscript with all my editor's notes in it. The Flight Portfolio. There it is. The title, finally on a printed page. These were like the galley proofs. Why did I call this book The Flight Portfolio? There was an actual object called the Flight Portfolio. It was a compendium of work by some of the artists and the visual artists who Varian Fry saved. And it was actually compiled a number of years, like 15 years after his time in Marseille, as a way of raising money for his organization, the Emergency Rescue Committee, which by that time was called the International Rescue Committee, which still exists and to which I encourage you all to donate because it's doing this amazing life-saving work for refugees right now. So I was so fascinated by this object, the Flight Portfolio, and thinking about what it looked like to gather together the work of these saved artists. I wanted it to be in my novel, even though chronologically speaking, it couldn't be. But that's the beauty of novel writing. You can alter the facts plausibly where they serve your purpose or illuminate something important. And so I proposed, or I posited in the book, a kind of proto-flight portfolio, an earlier version of that later flight portfolio, composed of the work of the artist who Varian was in the process of saving, also envisioned as a fundraising tool that one of the artists could possibly bring home to, or bring to New York, not home, future home New York, to show what was going on the ground in Marseille to people back here in the States. Because I think one of the chief challenges that Varian raised, that he faced, was to actually communicate how bad the situation was in Europe. The art itself did an absolutely brilliant job of communicating that, but it was coming in fits and starts. It was difficult to get it over from Europe. And so I imagined that one of his clients envisioned a portfolio of that work that would help to communicate what was going on. And then part of the story of this book is the struggle to get that artist and that collection of work out of France and the difficulties that Varian faced in trying to do that.
Okay, great. We have we have some amazing questions coming through. I love moderating for this reason. Somebody wrote, I've read the New York Times articles in mid-1930s based on Varian Fry's trip to Germany. Do you have a view as to why these were ignored, or do you know if the stories back then generated any action?
So isn't it amazing that despite the fact that so much information pre-existed the actual Shoah, so little was done? I think that that was a question I asked myself. Why was it that, given what we knew, given what was actually being reported in the press at that time, we somehow found it impossible to do anything about this? I think that one of the reasons that there was so little action was that there had also been horrific stories of what happened in World War I. And many of those stories were true and many of them were not. But people had this idea that the horror stories that were coming out of the continent might be overblown. That was number one. Number two, the United States very badly did not want to get involved in another war. They were in a deeply isolationist position at the time. Their losses in the First World War were unbelievable, and they simply did not want to become embroiled in another conflict like that. And so that was one of the reasons that that very little was actively done to stop what was going on. Once the United States entered the war and was engaged in that conflict incontrovertibly, I think one of the things that probably stopped us from doing what we eventually ended up under a moral obligation to do was a kind of pervasive and deep-seated anti-Semitism in this country. It was kind of codified. It was part of the culture. And there was this idea that perhaps we didn't want to lose American lives on behalf of potentially saving Jews. So there were a lot of factors, I think, that went into our inaction as a country. But then eventually we did step up to that challenge. And the horror and the difficulty of what we did during that war and the sacrifices that Americans made in that war can't be underestimated. But it was really a challenge for people like Varian and other like-minded individuals to communicate to Americans, not just at our level, but at the level of the highest levels of government, what was going on and the urgency of doing something to stop the horrors that were soon to take place.
Okay, great. We have a couple of other, thank you for that. Somebody sent in the fact that Varian Fry is buried at the Greenwood Cemetery right in Brooklyn.
That's
very
true.
Close to home. Much of the story was fictionalized. Do you think that, did anyone who actually worked with him get Yad Vashem recognition? And also, and as a side point, do you think that the love story overpowered a little bit what he did in the fact that he rescued so many people? So sort of like a twofold question there.
Yes, well, yes, in fact, he was recognized by Yad Vashem, but I don't know that any of his other colleagues were, although Harry Bingham certainly should have been if he hasn't been already. The question about the love story is a really great one. Varian Fry was gay, and he was unable to live openly at the time. As we understand, the morals of American culture were quite different from what they are now. And he had struggled all his life with the understanding that he was primarily attracted to men, but the social obligation to live a life that would have been more acceptable to other people. When he went to Marseille, for the first time, he was away from his wife. He was at liberty to form close connections to other people. And he was deeply involved with this man, Stéphane Hassel, who is a future French diplomat, and whose writings gave rise to the Occupy movement. In this memoir, Stéphane Hassel writes about his relationship with Varian in Marseille, how close they were and how intimate they were, and how important it was to both of them to have this respite from what was going on as Varian was working to try to help Stéphane and his family get out of France. I felt that once I understood the struggle that Varian faced around his sexuality, and the difficulty this relationship must have posed to him while he was in Marseille, and the tragedy that it ended up being in his life, that he was not able to continue it. I felt like I finally knew what was underneath that, that kind of blustering tone that I had encountered in his memoir. I felt like I finally understood what it was that he could not share with the rest of the world at that time. But thank goodness our times have now changed. And so the stories that gay men and women felt that they could not tell at that time are now at liberty to be told. And so fiction has this incredible ability to go back and rectify this kind of historical wrong. We can envision through the medium of fiction what somebody might have been feeling, what somebody might have done, what somebody might have wanted at the time. And through fiction's ability to allow us to inhabit another human being's mind, we can address and correct the historical record in a way. The interesting thing that happened around the publication of this book, was that shortly after it was published, a number of prominent critics came out and said, well, it's just unbelievable that considering how important this historical story was, this author, invented the fact that Varian Fry was gay for whatever reason. And it actually took Varian Fry's son writing a letter to the New York Times to say, yes, in fact, my father was gay, and his story needs to be told, and he needs to be understood as a gay hero of the Holocaust, not just a hero of the Holocaust. And finally, the historical record could be corrected. And it never had occurred to me that anybody might question this element of who Varian Fry was, because it's so very clear in the biographies and memoirs, as it is in his own writings that are archived at Columbia and elsewhere. But the fact is that I think it's still difficult for some of us to bring that level of complexity to the lives of the people who we think of as our heroes. And I'm just grateful that our times have changed enough for us to be able to do that, and for us to be able to use the medium of fiction as a way to a more complete truth.
Thank you, Julie. Wow, that's a great explanation. We also we're gonna wrap up in a minute, but I do want to mention, would it have, someone had asked, do you think it might have been interesting if you were able to list the names of the people who he saved in your book, as well as, are there any pieces of art that were recovered that we might know of or don't know of from Fry's actions?
So, so those are both great questions. There's a site online called almondseed.org, which has a lot of information about Varian Fry. It's curated by a filmmaker named Pierre Sauvage, who's been making a documentary about Varian's experiences for about the last 25 years. I hope that one day we will all see the incredible footage he has of the people Varian worked with. But I think he has a fairly comprehensive list. And there are other lists out there of Varian's incredible clients. And so I encourage you all to go and check them out. And let's see, what was the final question there?
Question about, first of all, can you repeat what that website was? It was hard to hear you.
It's almondseed.org.
Almond Seed.
If you Google Pierre Sauvage, Pierre Sauvage, then that website will inevitably come up.
And what was some of the other part of that question was,
does the work
artwork?
Yeah, what were the works? There are so many thousands of works that were saved thanks to Varian's efforts that I couldn't even begin to list them all here. But if you go online and you look at anything that was produced by Marc Chagall after 1941, if you look at anything that Max Ernst produced after 1941, or André Breton, or Jacques Lipschitz, anything that Hannah Arendt wrote after 1941, all of those were works that would not have existed if Varian had not done what he did. The trove of culture that exists now because of what he did is absolutely inestimable, which is why, again, I was so shocked that I hadn't heard of him, and why I want everyone to know about what he did. So thank you so much for being here and for making the investment of your time in this subject. I truly, truly appreciate having been able to talk to you about Varian and his work.
Thank you, Julie. I wanted to mention that Julie's books can be found on the Flight Portfolio, and her other novels can be found on Amazon, but also if you could also purchase from independent bookstores. Julie and I discussed that would really be a good thing to do right now, considering small businesses are suffering. And we've gotten some wonderful feedback. One question everyone does have before we wrap, is there going to be a movie?
Is there going to be?
And who's going to star in it, most importantly?
Has anybody seen the recent TV series Unorthodox?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so Anna Winger, who made Unorthodox, happens to be a longtime pal of mine, and she is in the process of developing the Flight Portfolio as a series right now.
Wow, that is fantastic.
So
fantastic.
Yeah, so I'm really excited about that. She's absolutely amazing, and I was totally blown away by Unorthodox. If you haven't seen it, you got to watch it. But she and I have been talking about this for more than a year now, and so it's in the works.
Fantastic and so exciting. So we had you first. We really appreciate, Julie, all of your insight. I think this is a particular subject that everyone's going to be Googling as soon as we get off the call. I wanted to, again, thank everybody for joining us. Thank you to Hadassah, Jewish Book Council, and on behalf of Arts and Talks, thank you for coming. Thank you to our senior connections and for Mara for helping us through the commemoration of Yom HaShoah. Again, during this very difficult time, it is especially wonderful to be able to be with our community, to see each other, to talk to each other, and still love arts and culture like we do. Please tune in on April 30th. We have our Understanding the Ballet series. The topic will be the beautiful ballet Giselle. So we look forward to having our dance director, Kristen McGrew, on to talk about that. That's next Thursday at 10:30. And thank you everybody who joined us today. And again, please take a look on our website for additional Arts and Talks information. And wishing everybody health, safety, stay home, save lives. And thank you again, Julie, for being here. And thank you all. We look forward to seeing you again very soon. Be well. I'm going to unmute everybody so everyone can say hello to each other if they want. And again, thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was wonderful.
Oh,
it was wonderful, enlightening, very enlightening. Food for thought.
Thank you.
To go
Thank
research.
you, Don.
Especially,
Thank you very much.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for having me, really. It's great to talk to you.
I hope Brian and the kids are well.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Judy.
Okay, everyone, have a wonderful day, really. Take care.
Thank you very much.
You know.